Thank you, Rabbi Askelovitz. So this is really the text session, where we're going to be analysing text after my introduction. And I assume everyone is in possession of these documents with some selections. At the beginning of those selections, I have written a disclaimer. Given the vastness of the Rebbe's educational corpus, the few sources cited below for the purpose of this textual study represent only an introductory sample of a much wider discourse comprising over 3,000 educational texts. So allow me to begin today with an expression of gratitude to Rabbi Schmidt and the organisers of this conference for extending their invitation to bringing me from down under to present this paper, or to present this introduction today. Another disclaimer, if I may. The reason I'm here is my focus on the educational writings of the Rebbe. What I've tried to do is apply standards of academic rigour and research to this domain. I'm going to try to describe the procedure used in the book and shortcut your 500-page reading today. But what I'm going to say is what you'll hear from me today concerning the thinking of the Rebbe is something you won't hear from every Chabad Chassid. And my understanding of the reason for this is because between 1950 and 1994, and even in fact up to this past Shabbat, most Chabad Chassidim will access the Rebbe's teachings via an 8-page, a 10-page little pamphlet known as a Likut. They're analyses of the weekly Torah portion or the current Jewish festival. These comprise edited versions of transcripts of talks given by the Rebbe throughout previous years. Now, the Rebbe personally edited these as many as 3 times or more before they went public for public consumption. They're compiled into 39 volumes of what is considered today the Rebbe's magnum opus, Likutei Sichot ala Parshiot ala Moedim, Likutei Sichot in short. So what we did different was we engaged in a horizontal, longitudinal study. Some would call it prolonged engagement. We chose 30 random samples, 10 from the Rebbe's leadership years of 1951 to 1964, another 10 random samples from 1965 to 1979, and then a final 10 from 1980 to 1992. And the aim of our research was to identify pervasive general themes or clusters of themes, and then to find transferal of these themes into specifically educational writings, educational concepts, educational recommendations from the Rebbe. Now, after we've done that, we proceeded to what we call purposive analysis by substantive experts. We're following the procedure set down by Lincoln and Guber. And they have a procedure where we took these findings, we applied the following procedures, peer debriefers, where we then sought from these experts clarification of just how accurate our conclusions had been. We used procedures known as devil's advocate or negative case analysis, where other texts, we invited them come up with other texts that contradict the findings. For example, initially we said the Rebbe was an optimist, so positive is his view of the human being. And they said, well, wait a minute, he was also a realist, and they brought sources that revealed that. And then we had to modify some of our findings. We engaged in audit trails, where we took these documents and more, and we actually analysed how many lines in the Rebbe's Sichos, in these 30 samples, were actually devoted to which themes. And finally, we engaged in triangulation, which is inviting experts to comment on the finding of other experts. Those experts included the Rebbe's personal secretaries, leading educators of Chabad institutions, Chabad educators outside the Chabad system, people outside the Chabad educational system altogether who dabbled in Chabad, what their findings were. Now, to shortcut that volume of reading, it goes something like this. As we did with the Sydney Yeshiva Bochrim, and I was introduced by a former Sydney Yeshiva student, we asked some of the Bochrim, okay, what are the major themes? You guys study Chassidut on a daily basis. What are the major themes of the Rebbe's Sichos? And generally, they sat down, and Rabbi Zolixon also did his time in Sydney, and they came up with a couple of themes, and it basically went with Mashiach and Ma'aseh B'Poel. Ma'aseh B'Poel means action, that everything has to be applied in actuality and action. But then we told them what actually happened, how you divide up a sample, 5,000 lines. I'm not going to give you all the samples, but let's say we take one of those periods of time and came up with the 5,000 lines of text. We found that 700 of those lines, and I'm rounding off the figures here, were dedicated to the Rebbe laying down the idea and expanding on the idea of Torah as a relevant teaching, something that is pertinent to our lives. And that was discussed this morning, not just the how, when, where of Torah, but how does Torah impact as a relevant guide and directive for the way life is to be led. That was 700 lines. 1,800 on what I called the positive view of the individual. We touched on the way an educator talks to the student. That includes positive communication. Also included in that section, I'm not going to list them all, were the redeemability of the individual, the folly of despair, and the idea that every descent is for the sake of subsequent ascent. And it might find its culmination in some of the texts that we're going to discuss this afternoon. The next major theme, which was 1,500, were, and this is, I guess, why the Yeshiva Bochrim sort of got it right when they said Ma'aseh B'Poel, those 1,500, what we call the transformational task, transformation of self, and the various means thereby, empathy as a key means of transformation of one's fellow, concern for the welfare of the individual, and transforming society and the world. And finally, and I'm leaving out some of those minor themes within those clusters, the theme of redemption was a major theme, with redemption as the ultimate goal of creation, anticipation and activation of redemption through our behavior, through the study of Torah, through observance, through virtuous living, and the attainability of this goal and all our goals. I should just point out, in that first study, we excluded anything that wasn't part of the Likutei Sichot or edited documentation, which meant we did not include the 30-plus volumes of Igrot Kodesh, the Rebbe's correspondence. The reason for that was the circumstances were kept confidential and are kept confidential, so we can't be 100% sure of the circumstances to which the Rebbe was responding with his educational response. Often, the recipient's name and identity, in most cases, if it's a sensitive issue, they're completely deleted. We couldn't follow up on it. Personal sections are replaced by ellipses, and they are situation specific. One of my personal hobbies is going behind the letters and trying to find out why the Bochum in Vancouver, who the Rebbe writes 3 letters to in the Igros Kodesh, when he wrote, he was not yet formally the Rebbe. He was in charge of Merkos Inyonei Chinuch, and he's pleading with the Hanhola, with the administration of the Montreal Chabad Yeshiva, take this boy in. Why did they not want to take him in? So these are areas that we didn't include in our first study, but please God, when Dr. Ray Lewis of La Trobe University and myself were continuing our research, and we're hoping to do, please God, down the track come out with something substantive. This will now be looked at, and we'll try to go further behind those letters and try to find out as much as we can, of course guaranteeing people the confidentiality which was the Rebbe was absolutely insistent on. Sociologists come through Australia quite often, and they have their view of what motivates Chabad. But I believe it's the teachings. Teachings like the view of the Jewish people as a Sefer Torah, where every letter corresponds to every Jew, and if a letter is missing, now hear this clarification, this analogy was clarified by the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's often misquoted. If a letter becomes erased or the Sefer Torah becomes pasul, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe communicated to his Hasidim. Many of them are living in Crown Heights today. He corrected that analogy. He said the letter never becomes erased. Dust, a film of dust may settle on the letter and it has to be delicately blown off, but he completely rejected the analogy that the letter is ever erased as an analogy for the Jewish people. Talks by the Rebbe, or pastoral letters like Kol Yeled Bocher, taking the story of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe and his son, and how his son had not heard the cry of the baby in the crib, and applying that to the cry of today's youth. This is something that motivates the Chabad Shlichim that you see today, including Rabbi Haskalovitz and the other rabbis, Rabbi Sherman and the other Chabad rabbis who are here today. Theoretical concepts such as Etzem HaNeshama, the essence of the soul, the quintessential soul, which can never become contaminated, as it were, or impure, these are ideas which lie at the heart of Lubavitch activism today. Or as Rabbi Sachs put it, the Rebbe's fame as a leader, organizer, and innovator of communal products has impeded a measured assessment of his originality as a thinker. So our current project, and I thank Professor Chazan for a 10-minute interaction today over lunch, where I've qualified something that I've said here today. We were looking at to see whether a cohesive educational philosophy exists within the Rebbe's writings. We're hereby changing that to whether a normative cohesive educational philosophy exists within the Rebbe's writings. Sorry? Yeah, we're going to explain that right now. Okay, we're going to look today at pivotal elements of the Rebbe's educational discourse, and we're going to make the argument that there's a strong likelihood that a cohesive, comprehensive educational philosophy exists, dispersed throughout 200 volumes of the Rebbe's writings. Prior to engaging in the investigation, let me say something which Professor Chazan does agree with, and that is all education can be divided into three categories. On the ground floor, there takes place educational activity, teaching, learning, training, demonstrating, disciplining, activities found in classrooms and educational settings anywhere. There's another level, it's called educational theory or policy, which is a body of connected principles, strategies, and recommendations that direct what take place on the ground floor. But at a still higher level, there is philosophy of education. The task of philosophy of education is to deal with the essential, fundamental issues that are at the heart of educational discussion. Now, this is a vital area because everything is ultimately predicated, everything in those lower levels is predicated on that educational philosophy. It's the ombudsman, as it were, to whom the theories and operations are accountable for their consistency and validity. Now, as Professor Chazan and I discussed today, there is a significant controversy as to what educational philosophy is, the pivotal elements of an educational philosophy, but there is some consensus that suggests a comprehensive and cohesive educational philosophy, a normative one, would do well to discuss and expound upon the nature of the learner, the nature of educational endeavor and its aims, and some of the texts we'll look at. A very small sample of texts, but nonetheless we'll look at them today. The role of the educator, the responsibility for education, education as a catalyst for a better society, and others put in there the authority for education. Now, some of the ideas I'll briefly give you an overview of, and then we'll go to the texts, include the Rebbe's view that emerged in our study, the infinite potential of the learner. Everything is education. The total demand on the educator, the central goal of education is virtue. This was also touched upon this morning in the Klalei HaChinuch VaHadrocha. And education empowers the learner infinitely to change the world. So these are the 5 points we're going to discuss today. And the texts will refer to those. So I want to make a distinction between what out there is called educational philosophy as opposed to educational thought. Now, both in Australia, Australian academics and overseas academics have called educational thought, they see that as referring to a collection of innovative but unrelated or fragmented insights into educational issues. And there are many, many anthologies of the Rebbe's educational writings, some very good ones. The problem that I have with these, someone was stating the same idea today at one of the discussions over lunch, is that they come up with a collection of innovative thoughts by the Rebbe. Educational philosophy is ignored by them, and this refers to a comprehensive, all-encompassing approach to education. Now, throughout history, there have been many great educational thinkers whose educational contribution is noted, and their writing may have contributed to particular areas of educational concern. But not all of them have contributed in educational philosophy. Now, we all know that the Rebbe contributed to educational discussion. But what's less well known to the wider readership, and this is the challenge that we face at this conference today, is that a significant portion of his writings deal with religious education, both under his jurisdiction and not under his jurisdiction. As was mentioned, he corresponded with successive American presidents on a variety of educational issues that included constructive utilization of vacation time, introduction of a moment of reflection into the public school system, promulgation of the Noahide laws. But even less well known is the fact that there is a whole, an order that encompasses these writings and renders them far more than clusters of educational thoughts. This is the Rebbe's educational philosophy, and it's here at the heart of educational debate that the Rebbe makes a significant and innovative contribution which is as yet undiscovered. Now, why is it undiscovered? If it's there, why is it undiscovered? Well, unlike his predecessors, the Rebbe didn't sit down and pen a Klalei HaChinuch VaHadrocha. And this is the general attitude of the Rebbe. He spoke, wrote, and responded to the pressing educational concerns of the moment. He didn't have time, as it were, with Klal Yisrael as his primary concern, to be a scholar in an ivory tower writing treatises. Chas v'shalom, not to suggest that his predecessors were. They were equally involved in the concerns of Klal Yisrael. But what the Rebbe did was he left collation of his works largely to others, endorsing and encouraging thematic collations of his writings. The second reason that this has been inhibited is disclosure of this all-encompassing educational philosophy can only take place through this prolonged engagement, the tedious task of extricating the educational material and its subsequent thematic organization, which is the stage Dr. Lewis and I at La Trobe University and I are up to at this particular point of time. And engaging in this thematic analysis is imperative, because if you don't do this, if you omit it, you're going to turn up what appeared to the untrained eye yet again to be fragmented, unsystematic educational ideals, and one fails to detect the comprehensive educational philosophy of which these ideas are but crucial components. So where do we turn if we're going to start looking for that educational philosophy? Well, the first place is the Rebbe's correspondence, his public addresses, his private audiences, and just sitting at this conference today, I'm hearing people relating communications. Rabbi Lou this morning about a communication that he received from the Rebbe, which was a personal communication. We've put together so far 3,500 such articles of correspondence pertaining specifically to education. Now, this is not surprising. It's remembered that the Rebbe presided over a primarily organizational movement. He clearly says education is his first priority. There are 3,500 articles of correspondence, addresses or discourses by the Rebbe on matters of educational concern. But I'm going to take it a step further, because often the Rebbe would write a pastoral letter. It's called the Michtav Klali, and he would send it to many people, and he would append it to a letter specifically written to an educator. And he would say, no doubt, having answered a specifically educational matter, no doubt you will find this of relevance to the educational matter under discussion. And one finds this in the Igros Kodesh. One can find this. An enclosure of a sikha, a talk, an address, an analysis of the parasha, an analysis of the Yom Tov, and he'll say, no doubt you'll find this pertinent to our educational discussion. Now I want to go back to what Rabbi Dr. Lowenthal was saying this morning. Howard Gardner's came up, I don't know, inadvertently or intentionally today in the discussion that was led by Professor Chazan. But I'm going to suggest that the Baal Shem Tov, to whose inheritance the Rebbe inherited, as it were, that legacy, and he was the inheritor and explicator of it, we could say that the Baal Shem Tov and Hasidism in general preempted the all-popular multiple intelligences made popular by Howard Gardner, a nice Yiddish boy, a son of Holocaust survivors. Perhaps 200 years earlier, multiple intelligences' emphasis on kinesthetic intelligence might have been there already when the Baal Shem Tov emphasized the importance of dance. Musical intelligence was there when the Baal Shem Tov stressed the importance of nigun, or melody. Intrapersonal intelligence was there when he stressed hitbonenut, or meditation and reflection. And interpersonal intelligence was definitely part of his teachings about Hasidic camaraderie. And if we use the left brain, right brain paradigm, one could suggest that the Baal Shem Tov sought to make Judaism of the analytic left brain Talmudist the possession of the right brain artisan, mystic, and dreamer. And then came Chabad's educational revolution, where Rabbi Schneerson of Liadi sought to render the intuitive and inspirational right brain contribution of the Baal Shem Tov in a format accessible to the logical, sequential left brain learner. And under Chabad's fifth Rebbe, as was mentioned this morning, this all became the subject matter of a curriculum for teenagers to be studied with no less rigor and intellectual engagement than the study of a Talmudic text. It is noteworthy that Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson saw himself first and foremost as an educator. Rabbi Luz looking at me, how do you know that? I heard from one of his close Talmidim that he was on a train once, and somebody, a Jew outside the parameters of religious observance, approached him and he said, "Who are you? What do you do? What do you do?" And he said, "Ich bin a malamed. I'm a teacher." The Friediger Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, said about himself, "I'm an educator." He wasn't lying. He didn't say a word that was untrue. He said, "I'm an educator." And in the 1940s, as we said, the publication of Kvalei HaChinuch V'Hadracha, but even more important, there's two letters from Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson imploring senior yeshiva students in New York at his yeshiva to enroll in special courses of pedagogical methodology conducted by Orthodox educator and world-renowned educational scholar Professor William Brickman, who was then the professor of education at NYU, and these took place at the Bedford and Dean Yeshiva, Chabad Yeshiva, and it was under his auspices that this teacher training program took place. We'll also have to look at the Rebbe's commentary of Rashi when the Rebbe says the 5-year-old child just beginning his study will understand this Rashi in a particular way, the comment of Rashi on the Torah, clarification of the ethics of the fathers about the ideal approach to learning. These are all areas where the Rebbe has a comment to make. And the Tzivos Hashem magazines that he edited, where he took exception to a grotesque exaggeration of the human face as an educational tool, also speaks volumes of an educational philosophy. The point can be made, well, I think it was John Dewey that said and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that all philosophy is education. Something that, and the point has also been made by one professor of education in Australia, that all education is ultimately philosophy. We can say that everything the Rebbe wrote has educational implications if we analyze it properly. So now we go to these 5 points, which we'll discuss today, and text will be distributed soon. I'm just going to give you an overview. Now, some of you are going to study a text which is text number 1, and if you feel that this is your area, please put up your hand and say, look, I want to study this, and I want to give you feedback, because we'll leave time at the end for feedback from the groups, because I'd be very interested to hear what the academics amongst us today glean from these texts. So the first text reveals what I call the first theme, the infinite potential of the learner. And this is the premise. And tying in with what was said today by Dr. Lowenfeld's presentation this morning, that the foundation of everything, and I think Rabbi Lou also said it, correct me if I'm wrong, both of you said it, the idea of the respect for the student and the love of one's student, it's viewing the learner and his infinite potential. Now we find this letter number 1. It's a groundbreaking letter. Perhaps the most potent and innovative feature of the Rebbe's educational philosophy is his view of the learner, and thereby, by extension, the very nature of educational endeavor. There's a distinctively positive view of, an insistence on the learner's limitless positive potential, however negative the prognosis may be. Current trends in educational philosophy tend to lessen expectations of the learner in order to accommodate challenges faced by the learner. But the Rebbe remained convinced that the learner is potentially capable of enormous outcomes, irrespective of and in sheer defiance of all prognosis and assessment. Precisely because of the negative prognosis, he would insist on the learner's limitless latent potential, of which it is in fact an indication. Trying circumstances of the challenged learner are indicative of a greater potential to overcome those challenges. And this insistence, unrelenting preoccupation with an as yet undisclosed positive potential, differentiate the Rebbe from those current trends which limit expectations of the individual who's from an underprivileged background or who faces handicap. So the Rebbe's belief in limitless untapped potential is clearly illustrated in that first letter, 1979, regarding education of Down syndrome learners, addressed to Coney Island Hospital's program director for the education of children in this category. So here the Rebbe recommends the educator maintain a positive view of the Down syndrome learner despite the prognosis. He expresses a view that enhanced educational success is contingent on a positive approach. He directs the social worker, teacher, anyone dealing with Down syndrome individuals to start from the basic premise that the challenge is in each case only a temporary handicap, and in due course it will be improved. This approach should be taken, he says, regardless of the pronouncements or prognosis of specialists in the field. And he gives his reasons. First, he believes that this approach is a precondition for greater success. The very confidence that such progress is in the realm of possibility will inspire greater enthusiasm in the teacher's work and will stimulate more intensive research. So this is, if you like, the application to practical situations of the Chabad principle, Tracht gut wird sein gut. Positive thoughts engender positive outcomes. And here the Rebbe applies that to education. Second reason the Rebbe gives is, if you like, predating the self-fulfilling prophecy 1997 made popular by Tauber, where the Rebbe says it's important to take this approach not only from the viewpoint of and for the worker and educator, but it's also for the trainees themselves. They have to be encouraged by word and manner of their training to feel confident that they are not, God forbid, cases, much less unfortunate or hopeless cases, that the difficulty is considered only temporary. With a concerted effort of instructor and trainee, the desired improvement could be speeded and enhanced. The Rebbe is concerned to avoid impressing the child with his or her handicap. At the same time, he cautions care should be taken not to exaggerate expectations through far-fetched promises, because false hopes will inevitably result deep disenchantment, loss of credibility, and other undesirable effects. So I was privileged to host Professor Reuven Feuerstein, world expert on the education of Down syndrome children. And in conversation with me, he confirmed that this was a radical suggestion when viewed against the backdrop of the educational climate of 1979. And here the Rebbe introduces something which he himself says is a chidush, a novel idea. And he writes, part of the above approach, which as far as I know has not been used before, is to involve some of the trainees in some form of leadership as captains of teams, group leaders, and the like, without arousing the jealousy of others. The latter could be avoided on the basis of seniority, special achievement, and exemplary conduct. The importance of Jewish education is stressed for Jewish children, whereas others were arguing it should be deleted. The Rebbe argues it will give a sense of belonging and attachment and a firm anchorage to hold on to, whether consciously or subconsciously. I'm going to move now away from this area, but I will say that the same approach applies to other areas. One finds this argument when dealing with individuals facing physical disability, detainees of corrective institutions, the elderly, the disenfranchised, the disadvantaged, and the antagonistic. In short, no setback is too daunting. The elderly are never too old. The juvenile are never too immature. And society's confirmed failures are never beyond hope. So we now move on to the theory of education. Everything is education. What is education? Education is everything, and everything is education. To the Rebbe, especially in the backdrop of this infinite potential awaiting actualization, life offers unlimited educational possibilities to reveal the limitless potential upon which education must be focused. And therefore the Rebbe urges we take the broadest definition of education, where nothing is outside the purview of the educator. A chance encounter of a student outside the parameters of the school day can be even more potent than a classroom interaction. At school, a chess game, a boat trip, a soccer game, or an art class provide opportunities for moral edification. There is no coincidence. It is no coincidence that the splitting of the atom, breakthroughs in space exploration, or even the death of Howard Hughes, after a life characterized by an ungenerous disposition, were subjects of public addresses by the Rebbe as matters of didactic significance. The educator's concern for the learner must go beyond formal hours of instruction. We have some text there on this. Defies limitations of subjects taught. This is of relevance to the way the Rebbe viewed the curriculum. He wanted educators to go beyond the formal curriculum. He writes to a teacher of agriculture in the school in Kfar Chabad in Israel that he can and must exert a positive influence in the area of religious observance of the students. And therefore he's insistent that all knowledge be used for purposes of moral edification, and that a component of moral edification be included in the curriculum. This also will feature in some of the texts, as he writes in a letter 1982 to President Reagan. I'll just take this section out of the letter. An education which imparts only knowledge, failing to give direction as to how that knowledge is to be usefully and constructively applied, is unworthy of the name education. And it would seem to me that this dimension in the Rebbe's idea be integrated into the curriculum, and not just to provide an add-on to an existing curriculum. And this is evidenced by his insistence that phenomena encountered in the course of the learning process be utilized by the educator as opportunities for character development of the learner. Third theme, the total demand on the educator. Others would call this educational responsibility. Already that first text that I gave you about the Down syndrome children is also viewed by some as coming under the category of educational responsibility. Because while some educators say, drop the Jewish component of the education, the Rebbe says, no, we have a responsibility precisely there we have to take responsibility for that dimension even in that case. The element of educational philosophy of the Rebbe, where everything is education now, leads to the role of the educator. And here I've given you some texts on Rabbi Shmuel ben Shilas from the Talmud, an educator ever concerned with his charges, even when off duty. So the Rebbe says, and I want you to analyze that text, no moment is too early, no detail inconsequential, no exertion ever unproductive. No teacher is ever too advanced to have outgrown the possibility of seeking a mentor of his own. No one is of a status so elevated that it precludes his involvement in the education of even the beginner and the youngster. No student is too unlettered that he or she cannot be empowered at some level to teach others. And I haven't had time for it to include it, but empowering is a very important aspect of the Rebbe's educational philosophy, as was also touched upon this morning. So we're all on the same page. Being an educator implies an awesome responsibility, but also a unique privilege. Now today, the teaching profession is preoccupied with its unfortunate circumstances, seeing itself to be one whose rewards and satisfactions are incommensurate with the excessive strain to which its practitioners are subjected. So the Rebbe would constantly point out to teachers that theirs was the happy lot. Now he championed educators' rights to generous remuneration, but he would simultaneously encourage educators to re-engage in their educational career by drawing their attention to the unique circumstances where even a minor exertion on their part will have a major influence over their students, rewarded with what he wrote and called cumulative dividends for generations to come. So once again, because he viewed learning potential as awaiting urgent activation and beckoning the educator to reveal it, his is an extroverted and proactive educational philosophy. The consequence of a failure to initiate educational interaction can leave the learner with his potential potentially undisclosed. And therefore, he urged the educator to be proactive. Now, we're also going to give analogies that the Rebbe used for the educational endeavor, particularly the horticultural analogy, which is used by other great educational philosophers throughout the years, but the Rebbe uses it, and I'm going to ask you to, when the time comes, to look at it yourself. But he first of all says a slight defect in the seed of the tree, the like of which in the grown tree may be of little or no consequences, it assumes major proportion in respect of the whole growth that is to come from the seed, to the extent of crippling it. Similarly, must the utmost care be taken to ensure the proper education of our children, boys and girls. A slight deflection may have a crippling effect, God forbid, upon the whole future of the child and for generations to come. Now, the fourth theme is the central educational goal is virtue. So the Rebbe employs this same analogy. And you have the roots, and here he's not talking necessarily education. The first goal is nurturing of beliefs and values represented by the roots. And here the Rebbe refers to an educatee's awareness of a higher authority and the acquisition of values that follow from this awareness. The world is not a jungle, but rather the individual must transform society's jungle and render it civilization. Rabbi Schneerson considered the second feature of the tree, the trunk, as indicative of a life of substantive virtuous accomplishment. The fruits of the tree, the third element, symbolize producing a learner who has been empowered to engage in selfless, altruistic endeavor and who will make a productive contribution to society as a whole. And the Rebbe wrote, because every student grows up to be an educator, whether as a parent or a teacher, or even simply as a member of society in which he or she lives, Jews have been inspired in their educational efforts by an unshakable belief that the effects of education are lasting and cumulative and reproduce from generation to generation. Because the Rebbe viewed education as the key to activating learner potential, education takes priority over all other considerations, including financial. It must impact on the realm of the learner's deeds and actions, and not remain theoretical, as anything devoid of practical application is antithetical to Judaism's educational philosophy. So focused is the Rebbe's educational philosophy on action that throughout his philosophy is insistent that the more abstract our excursions and theoretical our deliberations, the more imperative a resultant renewed initiative with enhanced tangible educational outcomes. It is these outcomes that do not merely impact on the learner alone, but on society at large, and are ultimately of cosmic significance. And I may stand corrected here once again by Professor Chazan, but I think the one element that all agree on in defining a philosophy of education is that it has to have implications for educational action and practice. And the fifth theme, before we subdivide into different subgroups, is that the education empowers the learner infinitely to change the world. Because of its potential for revealing latent good, the Rebbe saw education as a key to a more moral human being and a better world. The Rebbe's campaign for anticipation of a messianic ideal and its urgent realization can be viewed from the educational perspective. His 1991 call for an education whereby the child is a living exemplification of anticipating the messianic ideal, utterly focused on contributing to the ideal's urgent realization. The Rebbe was introducing a potent educational ideal whose practical outcome is that the learner, even a young child, view his or her ensuing conscious thought, speech, or action as a crucial factor in bringing this cosmic messianic ideal to fruition. This is reminiscent of Maimonides' requirement that every individual view his or her action, speech, or thought as a crucial cosmic significance in a precariously balanced universe. In the educational context, this call is an innovative application of Judaism's messianic ideal and belief in cosmic redemption to the practical living of the learner. Now, when I've presented a summary of the Rebbe's educational philosophy to groups beyond the Jewish community, I have yet to encounter one which had hitherto contemplated an educational approach which encourages a child to view his or her virtuous thought, speech, or action of universal importance. And we may well ask today, where in the wider field of educational philosophy do we find a voice that tells the child that his or her thought, speech, or action are indeed of cosmic significance? So in conclusion, we've identified already the start of a coherent educational philosophy. To be an educational philosophy, the elements have to be supportive of each other. And we've identified elements, and the argument goes something like this. Belief in the limitless potential of the learner has led Rabbi Schneerson to argue that everything is education, with every opportunity presenting an opportunity for disclosure of that potential. Now, this notion of education is everything, in turn, places a total demand on the educator that goes beyond formal limitations of the classroom. And this limitless potential of the learner calls for an education that is much more than just intellectual accomplishment, but rather education is concerned with the learner's virtuous conduct and with empowering the learner to infinitely change the world for the better. A more detailed analysis of the interrelatedness of these elements within the Rebbe's integrated worldview is the subject of our ongoing research. I thank you.